had a number of people over the last few weeks and even months ask me about how they can go about finding out whether or not their ancestors fought in the American Civil War, for example. I do a lot of Civil War gaming. I talk a lot about the fact that I have 13 known direct ancestors who fought in the Civil War and a number of others who were uncles or cousins. And I think that's true for most people. If you live in the United States and your family tree goes back in this country past the time of the Civil War, there's a very good chance that you have ancestors who fought in the Civil War. Now, every family is different. It depends a lot on what part of the country your family comes from. My wife's family, almost all from Ohio, even back into the 1840s. I can only find one of her ancestors who actually fought in the American Civil War, while I've got 13. Most of them were in eastern Kentucky. And eastern Kentucky is one of those places where pretty much every able-bodied young man ended up serving in some capacity, whether he enlisted or he was conscripted. So I want to just talk a little bit about some easy ways that you can find out whether or not your ancestor might have served in the Civil War. Now, I'm operating for the purposes of this discussion under the assumption that you already have some idea of who your ancestors are. If you don't, that's a completely different discussion that we can have at some point, and I can certainly offer you some advice down the road on how to go about finding who your ancestors are in the first place. It's not as hard as you think. So, for the purposes of this, let's assume you know the names and some basic information about ancestors you have who would have been of military age during the time of the Civil War. And by military age, I'm basically telling you to look at anybody who was born between 1820 and probably about 1845 for the most part. Now, there are some outliers. I have an ancestor who was born around 1810, who lied about his age and enlisted and was heavily involved in the Union Army from 1861 all the way to the time when he went home after the capture of Atlanta in 1864. So that happens. It also happens that very young people sometimes enlisted. I have an ancestor who was born in 1847, and as soon as he turned 18 in 1865, he enlisted in April of 1865, right at the end of the war. So he served, though he never saw combat. But for the most part, we're looking at people born between about 1820 to 1845. That's the place to start. So a couple of really easy ways to look right off the bat without even having to do a lot of research. I'll take you, just give you a look for a real quick second at one of my ancestors. I know his name was Enoch Thornsberry. He was born in Virginia around 1826. I know that from various records. He died in Elliott County, Kentucky around 1881. So let's say that's all I know about a guy. I could go to a website like findagrave.com. Now, I should say up front, pay no attention to spelling. Spelling is relatively meaningless when we're talking about people in the 1800s, most of whom couldn't read or write. So my last name, for example, I've seen spelled about 7 different ways in records for the same person. But a name like Thornsberry, for the most part, is going to be spelled this way. Sometimes you might see it B-U-R-Y, things like that. So don't get discouraged if you look and you don't find something under a particular name, unless it's something easy to spell like Smith. So, but let's assume for a second Enoch Thornsberry spelled just this way. I'm going to go to this website, findagrave.com, which basically is a website where people put records from cemeteries. Now, probably 2/3 of my ancestors who fought in the Civil War have no grave marker whatsoever. So there's a chance there might not even be a grave record, and if there is, it may not be in this website. But in this case, Enoch Thornsberry, we're going to say we know for sure he died in 1881. I know he was born around 1826, but I'm not 100% sure of that, so it doesn't have to necessarily be exact. But for this purpose, I'm just going to say that I know he died in 1881. I'm going to delete the birth date altogether. I'm going to look throughout all of Kentucky for a grave record. And here we go. Private Enoch Thornsberry, born 1826, died 1881. Elliott County, Kentucky. Now, I know from my own information that that's where he lived. So I'm just going to click on this, and right off the bat, I can see he's got a Confederate grave marker at his cemetery that looks relatively new that somebody has placed in the last few years. And it tells me right there, he was in Company E, 13th Kentucky Cavalry, CSA. That's the Confederate States Army. He's got the Southern Cross there at the top, got a Confederate grave marker there. 13th Kentucky Cavalry was a unit that was made up of men in eastern Kentucky who fought for the Confederate Army. So I actually have a ton of relatives, ancestors and uncles and cousins who fought in this unit because it was, units were largely formed in the area in which they lived. And so you'll often see 3 or 4 brothers who fought in the same company in the same regiment, or guys from the same town who all were in one company. Sometimes even men who were all of the same profession who enlisted in the same company. And so it could be ugly for a town who might have a company like some units in the 26th North Carolina at Gettysburg, where the entire company was killed or wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg. And so families in the same town losing multiple men. So right off the bat, that's a real simple way that I was able to find out some basic information that one of my relatives fought in the Civil War. Now, it's not usually that easy. So let's go back, and I want to look at my family tree again. And I'm going to look at a different line, and I want to just talk real briefly about digging a little deeper to find out some information about whether or not a person served. So I'm going to go down here to my mom's side of the family, and I'm going to look at this guy here. And again, Daniel SAR V, sometimes it's spelled Servey, S-E-R-V-E-Y. I told you spelling means nothing. This is a guy born in 1819, so he's a little bit older. He was about 42 years old when the war breaks out. Doesn't mean he couldn't have served. But again, I know in this particular case that he's got a Civil War grave marker. And so that makes it really easy for me because I know he fought in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And the death date matches up, things like that. But let's say I didn't know anything about the grave marker. In 1890, if your ancestor was still alive in 1890, the United States did its every 10 years census, as it often did. The 1890 census was largely destroyed in the fire, but what wasn't destroyed in a fire was the Veterans Census. Every person who fought in the Union Army during the American Civil War, if they or their widow was still alive in 1890, was enumerated in that census. Now, on a website like Ancestry.com, I can go and I can actually look at that record and I can see whether or not they were in that census. So I'm going to pull that up here in just a second. Okay, so Ancestry.com is a great resource for finding a lot of this information now. A lot of it is a paid service. I happen to have a membership, so you're somewhat limited if you don't for websites that I'm going to show you today, like Ancestry.com or Fold3.com, which focuses mostly on military records and has a lot of great resources for the Civil War. But in this case, I'm going to go to Ancestry. I'm going to type in the information about my ancestor, Daniel SAR V. Like I mentioned, sometimes it's spelled S-E, but it'll search for it either way. It does what's called a soundex search, which basically goes for the consonant sounds rather than exact spelling, unless I tell it to. I know he lived in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. I know he was born around 1819, so I'm going to search for a guy who matches that information. And of course, I can see right off the bat, these are all my ancestor. This is the 1880 census record, his 1870, his 1850. So those are all him. But what I'm going to look for here in the census records is I'm going to look for the 1890 census, because that's the one I'm talking about that enumerated veterans. It's called the Veterans Schedule. And so right here, right off the bat, I can see right here Daniel W. Servey, which I know is his name, Monroe and Curlsville in Clarion County, Pennsylvania. That's my guy. He lived in Curlsville. So I'm going to go right to that page in the Veterans Schedule, and I'm going to see some information that he provided himself about his military service. Right here he is listed right here, number 177, Daniel W. Servey. He was a sergeant in Company I, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He says that he enlisted October 14th, 1861. and that he stayed in the Army until July 1st, 1865. Presumably at that point, the entire regiment was probably mustered out of service at the end of the war. So he says he served for 3 years and 9 months in the service. So I've got a lot of information right off the bat that I can learn about him. Company I, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, that's his unit. I know when he started, I know when he finished. So I know now that I can look at that unit, and unless he was ill or on other duty, chances are anything that unit was a part of, any battle, any skirmish, during those times, he was probably there. Now, there's some ways you can find out more about that, but he also gives some information down here. You look at number 26 and you go down here. He says he lives in the Curlsville is his post office location, and they're also looking for any disability that they allege occurred during their service. And a lot of men did this because, as you're going to find out in just a little bit, I'll talk about this, probably the best resource for finding a ton of information about your ancestors' involvement in the Civil War comes from whether or not they filed for a pension, a veteran's pension, after the war. And we'll look at some of that in just a little while. But he says he had an enlargement of the heart and that he was a veteran. Some men might say things like here, like wounded in the left leg, or a gunshot wound in the lower jaw. So these men will talk about if they were wounded during the service, and they'll mention where and maybe even when that happened, because they would have filed for a pension and said, hey, I got shot in the leg during the service, and now I can't do any work, so pay me money. And a lot of men would do this, and a lot of those pensions got rejected, but some did not. So now I want to go to Fold 3, because Fold 3 is a great resource for finding more about whether or not they filed for a pension. So let's go ahead and look again at Daniel Sarvey. And we're actually going to look, I'm going to go down here to Civil War records and look at the Civil War Pensions Index. He lived until 1894. There's a good chance he filed for a pension. So I'm going to look for Daniel Sarvey, and there's actually some ways you can narrow this down. You can see it doesn't show anybody listed. And there's some reasons for that. It may be that he's listed as Daniel Survey. This one is a little more testy when it comes to exact spellings of names. So here we go. We've got a Daniel W. Survey, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, Company I. This is my guy. It was that simple. So now I can see this is a pension index card. It tells me here. Now this says enlisted in January of 1864. Now here's a reason for that. He actually re-enlisted then. So don't get thrown off by that. His first 3 years of service were up. He re-enlisted at that point for another 3 years until the end of the war. But we know this is my guy, Company I, 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Tells me here that he enlisted on April 7th, or that April 7th, 1879 is when he filed for a pension. Here's the application number for his pension. I believe these are basically in numerical order, so he was about 278,000th in line to file a pension. Certificate number means he actually was granted that pension. If there's no number here, that means he probably applied but was rejected for that pension. Also at the bottom, it tells me he died April 10th, 1894 in Curlsville, Pennsylvania, which is information I already know about my ancestor, that's when and where he died. So that kind of confirms the information that I already knew from other records. Now, what you want to do with this is you want to get that pension file, because there's a ton of information in there. One of my wife's ancestors, the one and only one that I know fought in the war, who's a man named Charles Miller. He was in the 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery. The Heavy Artillery regiments were originally stationed in the forts around Washington, D.C., but in 1864, when Grant went south to confront Lee in the spring of 1864, he pulled all of those regiments off of fort duty and put them into the field as infantry. These huge regiments of like 2,000 men. And so Charles Miller, who was my wife's ancestor, was in this heavy artillery regiment. They assaulted Petersburg. He was wounded, captured by the Confederates, had a leg amputated by a Confederate surgeon, and filed for a pension. Now, I get into his pension file, and lo and behold, there is a tintype photograph of Charles Miller in his pension file. Never had seen this before. It's in the archives in Washington, D.C. And the reason for it was that after the war, Charles Miller ran out on his wife. And because he ran out on his wife filed a claim for half of his pension. And she sent this picture in so government agents could find him and track him down. There's a lot more to that story than that, but you never know what you'll find in these pension files. I've found detailed records of their service. Daniel Survey, for example, in his pension file, he talks about how he was assigned to General McCall during the Peninsula Campaign as an orderly sergeant who would carry orders to other generals and messages. And he describes in his pension file, in his own words, how he was sent by General McCall with a message for General John Reynolds during one of the battles in the Peninsula. And he actually ended up riding so hard that that's when he got that heart condition that he talks about. And he also was wounded by a shell that caused some loss of hearing in one of his ears. And he describes all of this great information. And that actually General McCall was captured by the rebels during this battle. And so when he comes back from General Reynolds to find the man he's assigned to, he's gone because he was captured. I learned all of this because of this pension file. Now, the pension files, by and large, about 90% of them, if you want to get those records, you're going to have to apply to the National Archives and have them send them to you. I believe they can do that digitally now. Used to be you would send it in and they would mail the information. It would take months. But some of these records are actually on this website, on fold3.com. Now, they've only gotten through about the first 10, 11% of those records on there. So chances are, if you want to find them available online in Fold 3, what you're looking at are people who were either killed or severely wounded during the war and therefore applied for their pension pretty early on. So I'm just going to go into one of these randomly because I don't know of any of my family members who actually have these online. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up a Civil War widow's pension or a veteran's pension and let you take a look at what might be included in one of those. All right, so here's one I found that actually does have a connection to my family. This is David Tabor, and he was a private in Company D, 22nd Regiment Kentucky Volunteers. They were a mounted infantry regiment, as were most infantry regiments in the Union Army during the Civil War in Kentucky. David Tabor is actually the first husband of my great-great-great-grandmother. So he's no relation to me, but she remarried after the war to my great-great-great-grandfather and had several more children. But so right off the bat, we can see in this widow's pension, this is David Tabor. This is actually a brief in the case of Sarah and Mary Tabor. They were actually David's minor children. And the pension was filed on their behalf because his widow had remarried, and so she was no longer entitled to a pension. She actually remarried to another Civil War veteran, my great-great-great-grandfather. So he could have filed for a separate pension. But in this case, right off the bat, we can see here that David Tabor died March 22nd, 1862 of typhoid fever. And there's a lot of information here. The Adjutant General USA gives the date as March 30th, 1862. So there's some discrepancy about it. But basically we know that's when he died. Affidavit in the office of officiating minister shows that Nancy Brown, that's my third great-grandmother, and David H. Tabor were married April 12th, 1859. So they're establishing a timeline to show why this pension is valid. Number one is to prove that this woman and this man were married, and then they had children who would be entitled to the pension. Sarah was born October 20th, 1860. And as long as she's under 16 years old, she can file this pension. Mary is born July 18th, 1862. So a lot of information. A lot of it's just kind of genealogical or even just kind of in terms of legal things that need to be established in order to prove that the pension can happen. But what you'll see in a lot of these is you'll often see things, for example, in one of my relatives' pension files, the family had to prove that their child, their son, had been supporting them financially, and that was why they were entitled to the pension, in this case, the mother and father. And so they actually provided letters that this young man had written home from the service in which he mentions sending money back to them to help them out. And so I see these letters written by a man who was killed at Nickajack Creek outside of Atlanta in 1864. And I get to see firsthand in his own words what he wrote, these letters, and I'm holding them in my hand because I went to Washington, D.C. to the National Archives. You can actually fill out, you can go in that morning, fill out some information of what you know about this relative, they will pull that file and allow you to take a look at it and look at the first-hand documents, the originals, and you can make copies of them. Or in my case, I actually take pictures of them with my iPad, and it puts them into a PDF file, and I'm able to save those things. And so you can see all of this information. You can see letters that were written. You can see medical reports that are given. You'll see the original casualty reports if a person was killed in the war. And all of this is in these pension files. But that's once you know who they are. So I want to go back now and talk a little bit more about some other ways to find out information about your ancestor's Civil War service. And I want to go back now and look at military records, which are different than pension records. Let's say you know the name of your ancestor and some basic information about him, but there's no tombstone record on Find a Grave, and there's no pension record. Especially if they're a Confederate veteran, there's not going to be a pension record. There's some other places that you can look. So I'm going to take a look here at Joseph Cobb, who's one of my ancestors. Excuse me, he's my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Born in 1840 in Knox County, Kentucky. He died in 1922 in Menifee County, Kentucky. Now, there's another database on Ancestry that is available in other places as well. It's called the U.S. Civil War Soldiers and Profiles, 1861 to 1865. Now, in this case, a name like Cobb is pretty hard to spell different ways, so I'm just going to assume that they got the spelling right. And again, I'm going to say he's from Kentucky, and let's see what we find. Okay, there's nothing showing up here. So I'm going to loosen the search a little bit. And so now let's take a look. We've got not a lot of real great help right here. Instead of saying lived in Kentucky, because that actually restricts the search too much, I put military as the state of Kentucky. So I'm looking for men named Joseph Cobb who served from the state of Kentucky. And you can see there are two listings here. And the first one shows that he is from Moccasin, Virginia. So I know this isn't my guy because he lived his whole life in Kentucky. Now look at this guy here. Residence in 1862 is Wolfe County, Kentucky. He says he was a first sergeant when he enlisted. Company E, Kentucky 14th Cavalry Regiment. And it says here that he died in Frenchburg. I don't know why it says this, but Menifee County, Kentucky is what it should be. So that's my guy. So now I know I'm looking at somebody in Company E, 14th Kentucky Cavalry Regiment. Now something you should know, especially about places like Kentucky, a lot of times these regiments had different designations. For example, in Pennsylvania, every regiment, every volunteer regiment that enlisted was given a number starting with 1 going up. But if they got redesignated as cavalry, for example, they still had that alternate designation. So my ancestor Daniel Survey, I showed you earlier, was in the 64th Pennsylvania Volunteers. Well, the 64th Pennsylvania Volunteers was not the 64th Infantry. It was the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. So it gets a little tricky at times with that. And the same thing with the Confederate Regiment. Sometimes they had alternate designations. But I want to take you to another place that you can get some great information. There's a website called civilwardata.com. And when you go to this, again, I've got a membership for this, so I can log in and I can see a lot more. It takes you to a number of things here, and one of them is their personnel directory. So I know I'm looking for a guy in the Confederate Army named Joseph Cobb who served the state of Kentucky. And I want to see what civilwardata.com can tell me. Well, here's my guy, Wolfe County, Kentucky. He was a first sergeant. I can see here that it says that he died at the age of 83. He was a first sergeant. He survived the war, but we don't know more than that. So now I can actually click on that unit he was in and see who they were assigned to during the war. This tells me they were in Williams Brigade as part of the Department of Western Virginia. Then they were in the Department of East Tennessee, etc., etc. I can see if there are any known photographs of men who were in that regiment. And here's one. There's one guy, Spencer Adkins. I've got a photo of him. But what's really cool about this is regimental casualty analysis. This actually will tell me all the different dates that there were casualties and what the nature of those casualties were. So I can see on February 14th, 1863 in Floyd County, Kentucky, that one man from that regiment was listed as a POW. And I can see that was John Robinson, who was a private. How this gets to be really cool is when you look at, let's say you're doing research on a particular unit. So I want to think of one of the units that I know suffered a ton of casualties. So I'm going to look up the 1st Minnesota Regiment, 1st Infantry. So let's look for the 1st Minnesota. And there are a lot of 1st regiments, obviously. So 1st Indiana, 1st Massachusetts. All right, so here's the 1st Minnesota Regiment. And I can see that they were part of the Department of Northeast of Virginia. Then they were in the Army of the Potomac and Stone's Brigade, which later became the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps. I can also see that during the war, they lost 177 men killed or mortally wounded, enlisted men, 10 officers. Let's look at that casualty analysis, because you can see right here at Gettysburg on July 2nd, 1863, they had 39 men killed, 176 wounded. And then I can go and actually see who the men were that were killed at Gettysburg. And here's a list of all the men who were killed at Gettysburg. And then I can look at information about each one of them. I can see William F. Bates was from Lake City, Minnesota. He enlisted on such and such a date. He was killed July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg. He was Company B. So another cool place you can sometimes find information about your relatives is in newspaper records. Newspapers.com is a great resource for this. You can search by location, by name, narrow the search dates. So I did that, and I found my guy, Joseph Cobb, who is a Confederate veteran, in this newspaper from the Mount Sterling Advocate, which Mount Sterling's near where he lived. And this is dated from 1892, and it talks about the ex-Confederate soldiers and members of the Menifee County Confederate Association met and elected their leaders. And I can see down here below that it tells me that on motion, the chairman was directed to appoint 2 members from each precinct of Menifee County as committee on arrangements. And Joseph Cobb was selected from precinct number 3 to represent that precinct and the Confederate veterans. There are some other really cool things that I can read about Joseph Cobb in different records. Late in life for some of these veterans, some of the southern states, obviously Confederate veterans were not eligible for federal pensions. They fought against the federal government. They weren't going to get a pension for their service. But some of the states for whom they served decided very late, when there were a few men left, to offer pensions. Kentucky was one of those states that offered pensions to Confederate veterans. And Joseph Cobb was one of those people, because he lived into the 1920s, that was around long enough to have actually received a Confederate pension. And again, Ancestry.com has some of those records. And so I'm going to pull those up here in just a second and let you see some of what his Confederate pension had to say. Okay, so if I narrow things down to pension records with the name Joseph Cobb, I can see this list. There's Alabama Confederate pension records. In this case, I know he's from Kentucky. There's Tennessee, Arkansas. I'm going to go to Kentucky Confederate pension records. These are all between 1912 and 1930. So I'm not going to find anything unless I know the guy fought for the Confederacy from Kentucky and was still alive at this time. In this case, I know Julia Nickel was my Joseph's wife's name. I know that he was from Menifee County. And so here we have an application from 1922. These are really cool, and I'll show you why. Because in these applications, they actually answer firsthand some questions. In this case, this is the widow who's answering the questions. She says she was born in Morgan County. Her maiden name was Julia Nickel. She talks about her husband being born in Knox County, Kentucky, Joseph Cobb. They were married in Morgan County, etc. But actually, there is a questionnaire in here where before he died, Joseph actually answered some questions, and it's really cool the way that he answers some of these questions. And here's some letters here. It's all very similar to what you find in the Union pension files. But let me skip ahead and I'll let you see what he had to say about his service. So you can see here that this is his application for the pension. Now he says Sergeant Joseph Cobb, Company E, 10th Kentucky Cavalry. And there were actually 3 or 4 different 10th Kentucky Cavalries during the Civil War. So it gets a little tricky in Kentucky with trying to find which unit they were. They usually had descriptive names. In this case, Joe Cobb was in the unit known as Diamond's Yankee Chasers, and there's actually a book written about them that I've been able to get my hands on. So he says he was born in Knox County, Kentucky in the year 1840. He says, I first enlisted in April 1862 in Captain Swanger's or Swaney's company of the 5th Kentucky Infantry, which later became part of what was called the Orphan Brigade. But that unit disbanded and reorganized into the 10th Kentucky Cavalry, and a new 5th Kentucky Infantry was formed. So he became part of that in October 1862. Colonel John S. Williams, Jack May, Lieutenant Colonel, Henry Hawkins, Major of the 5th Kentucky, 10th Cavalry officers, and then he lists those. He says, how did you get out of the Army? I surrendered and was paroled on May 1st, 1865 at Mount Sterling, Kentucky. Were you ever in prison? If so, state what prison and when released. No, sir, I never let them get their hands upon me. I love that. Were you paroled? Yes, at Mount Sterling, May 1st, 1865. Did you take the oath of allegiance to the United States government? Yes, I swore to respect my parole. And it just talks about the circumstances, again, of that. A lot of great things in here that you can find where he talks about that. State the income of yourself, your wife, information, all personal information. But the main thing here is I get some more detail about his service and the nature of it. And so now I can go and look at things like, okay, so what did a first sergeant do in the Confederate Army? And I can learn a little more about what his role was. Excuse me, there's one other really important resource once you find a person you think may have been your relative. And those are the military records themselves. So Civil War service records. Now, almost all of these are online on fold3.com. You don't have to go to the National Archives. There are some states, they only have the index. So you see Arizona, California, Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, Missouri, New Hampshire. So a lot of the northern states, they only have the index cards. So you don't get a lot of the details. Kentucky's an exception to that. So again, we're going to go to Kentucky Confederate records, which aren't necessarily always as good as the Union records. But I'm going to go to the 10th Kentucky Cavalry. And I told you he was in Diamond's Yankee Chasers. So that's Diamond's cavalry, not Johnson's. And we're going to look for Joseph Cobb. Now, you're often going to see multiple names that maybe are the same last name because, again, I said brothers sometimes all served in the same company. So if you see and you go into this by name and you see a list and you see multiple last names that are the same, there's a decent chance that they were related to each other and even from the same town. So we're going to look at Joseph Cobb's military records. There's not a lot here. The Confederate records are not often very good. But sometimes you can see things like this. So this is the company muster roll. These were typically done every 2 months. In this case, this covers a lot more than that. But we can see that he was at least at one point absent in the hospital sick. Here we can see when and where he enlisted, when he was last paid, things like clothing allotments, etc. Not a lot here. That's how the Confederate ones are. Let me go into a Union one and show you some of the difference. So here's a really good one from the Union side of the military records. This is Henderson. It's actually Gearhart. You can see that they actually have the name listed correctly here, but then most of the files they just miss the H. And that's why I said don't really pay attention to spelling. In Kentucky, they often pronounced the last name Gearhart as Gayhart. So that's why I see sometimes it's spelled as G-A-Y or even G-E-A. But this is my guy. I know that from other research. He was a corporal in Company F, 39th Kentucky Infantry. Now, I can see a lot of information about him from this. I can see he was 18 years old when he enlisted. I can see where he enlisted. But I want to take you through some of these. You can see every 2 months they did these muster rolls, March and April. He was present. This is a good way to know whether or not your ancestor was at a particular battle. If he's listed as absent sick in the hospital in July of 1863, you know he probably didn't fight at Gettysburg with his unit, etc. In this case, he was captured by the rebels June 27, 1863 in Breathitt County, Kentucky. Why that's significant is because it starts to give me a picture of what happened with Henderson Gearhart. A lot of men in Kentucky fought for both sides, not necessarily by choice. A unit would come to town, they would conscript all of the men of military age into the service. This happened a lot with the Confederate Army. They would draft men into their service who did not support their cause. First chance they got, those men would desert, and often they would turn right around and join the Union Army as a result. That's what Henderson Gearhart did. He was conscripted into the Confederate Army. He actually had at least one older brother who fought in the Confederate Army and a couple who fought in the Union Army. So when he gets captured, he's captured by men who know him. And these men who know him know he deserted from the Confederate Army. And so what you end up seeing here, and I'll skip ahead to this, is you see that he actually gets sent to Richmond, Virginia to stand trial for desertion. So here's a memorandum from prisoner of war record, and it tells me here, Henderson Gearhart, private company, he was actually a corporal by then, Company F, 39th Kentucky, a prisoner of war sent to Richmond, Virginia, charged with desertion from the 10th Kentucky CSA, the same unit that my Joseph Cobb was in. So it says that he eventually was, I don't know what happened with that, but he was sent there September 23rd, 1863. But I know what the end result was for Henderson Gearhart, and I know that from this casualty sheet that was filled out by the Union Army. And it says that he was a corporal, Company F, 39th Infantry of Kentucky. Casualty was death. The cause is not stated, but the source of the information is from muster out record dated September 15th, 1865. The muster roll for July and August says captured on scout, June 27th, 1863. But here it is, place of discharge or death, Andersonville, Georgia. Now the Andersonville records do not give me an indication as to when or how Henderson Gearhart died, so he's obviously one of those unmarked graves at Andersonville. But eventually he was sent to the prison camp down in Andersonville, and I know that that's where he died from these records. So there's a lot of great resources out there. You just kind of have to know where to look and how to start looking. So there's a lot more I could show you. But number one, if you know enough about your ancestors, start with the ancestors who served or who were alive that were born between 1825 and about 1845. That's kind of your sweet spot. They could be a little earlier, they could be a little later, but for the most part, most men were going to be in that age group. Especially 1835 to 1842, 1843. I would say most men of military age in those places, especially in the South, most likely served. When you do that, go to somewhere like Fold3, go to Ancestry.com, start looking at those 1890 census records to see if they were in the Union Army. They might have reported that if you know where to look. Look in military records, look at enlistment records, look at even things like in 1863 there was a draft record for all men of military age living in the North. And if they had previously served, they would have recorded that information. Look on findagrave.com. If you know where they might be buried or about when they were born and died, you might find a military headstone for them that could give the details of that information. But there's a lot of great resources out there. If you want to use the comment section below, I know a lot of you don't have access to these websites because they require a paid service in some cases. If you have somebody in particular that you're looking at and you want to know whether they served, put what you know about that person in the description below on this video, and I'll see what I can do. I'll look them up for you. I'll see what I can find out. Can't spend a lot of time on it, but I can at least check all these sources that I just checked and let you know. I'll do another video down the road sometime just showing you how you can get back to find out who your ancestors even were then, so that you can begin this process. But this video is for people who might already know who they were, but just want to know. If you have further questions, I know that I didn't cover everything, and maybe some of it didn't make a lot of sense. Use the comment section below. Ask your questions. I'll do my best to respond to all of those things when I'm able to. But use this as a great resource. I'd love to help you find out. It's a great thing to be able to have that personal connection to our history. It makes it come much more alive to me. I never would have known, for example, about the Battle of Raymond, which took place in Mississippi during the war, because it was a minor battle, but it was a major battle to the men of the 20th Ohio Infantry one of whom was my ancestor Samuel Hughes, who was a corporal in Company H. So I know that was a really big deal, and so I learned a lot about that, and I know that I had a relative who was there, and so it gives me that personal connection. So do that. It's really worth it, and I'd love to help you out if I can. So use the comment section below for that, for any questions you have, and I'll help you out. Thanks a lot, and we will see you again real soon.